The reading is Matthew 21 through 15. For the kingdom of heaven is like the landowner who went out early one morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay the normal daily wages and sent them out to work. At 9 o'clock in the morning, he was passing through the marketplace and saw some people standing around doing nothing. So he hired them, telling them he would pay them whatever was right at the end of the day. So they went to work in the vineyard. At noon and again at 3 o'clock, he did the same thing. At 5 o'clock that afternoon, he was in town again and saw some more people standing around. He asked them, "Why haven't you been working today?" They replied, "Because no one hired us." The landowner told them, "Then go out and join the others in my vineyard." That evening, he told the foreman to call the workers in and pay them, beginning with the last workers first. When those hired at 5 o'clock were paid, each received a daily wage. When those hired first came to get their pay, they assumed they would receive more, but they too were paid a day's wage. When they received their pay, they protested to the owner, "Those people worked for only 1 hour, and yet you paid them just as much as you paid us, who worked all day in the scorching heat." He answered one of them, "Friend, I haven't been unfair. Didn't you agree to work all day for the usual wage? Take your money and go. I wanted to pay the last worker the same as you. Is it against the law for me to do what I want with my money? Should you be jealous because I am kind to others?"
Thank you, Betsy. Did God make us after we made God? That's the question that Andy Partridge, the founder and leader of the 1970s and 1980s rock, pop, and punk band from the United Kingdom called XTC, asks in one of the band's most well-known songs, a song called "Dear God." Now, I have to admit, I'm a little jealous because for a self-proclaimed atheist, Andy Partridge writes a pretty good religious song. And by good, I mean good as in spiritually and theologically challenging, thought-provoking. Here's some of the lyrics. Dear God, hope you got the letter. Excuse me. And I pray that you can make it better down here. I don't mean a big reduction in the price of beer, but all the people that you made in your image, see them starving on their feet because they don't get enough to eat from God? I can't believe in you. Dear God, sorry to disturb you, but I feel that I should be heard loud and clear. We all need a big reduction in the amount of tears. And all the people that you made in your image, see them fighting in the street because they don't have opinions meet about God? I can't believe in you. And then there's this line, a question that Partridge asks. Did you make mankind after we made you? It is a common question that atheists ask, reflecting atheism's position that God is a human invention and not a lived, experienced reality. In response to Andy Partridge, I could point out to the significant body of research that has accumulated over the years, and particularly in more recent years from neuroscientists and what are called neurotheologians like Andrew Newberg, which suggests that rather than an invention of humanity, that we are hardwired for God. What that means is that religion and the Bible and church and spiritual exploration of all kinds, rather than an invention, are a response to the innate human need to try and understand and connect with the divine, the transcendent. I could respond to Andy Partridge in that way with all that nerdy stuff, but instead, I think I'd rather respond to him with a challenging question of my own. If we made God, we invented God, tell me, what human would intentionally invent a God like this? Like the one Jesus presents to us in the passage that Betsy just shared with us from Matthew's Gospel. It goes by various names, most usually the parable of the workers in the vineyard or the parable of the vineyard workers, something along those lines. But I think a pretty good case could be made for a different title, for calling this story the parable of the world's worst business owner. I mean, seriously. Guy owns a vineyard, harvest time comes around, knows he needs workers. So, as was the common practice in that time and place, he goes down to the marketplace first thing in the morning, 6 a.m., to hire some day laborers. Finds some, goes back to the vineyard, a couple hours later, realizes he didn't have enough workers. Goes back to the marketplace, finds some more day laborers, hires them, agrees, as he did with the 6 a.m. workers, to pay them the expected daily wage. At that time and place, what was supposed to be enough to take care of the needs of a family for at least a day and hopefully more. Goes back at 9 a.m., gets some more laborers, goes back to the vineyard, discovers once again he doesn't have enough workers. Goes back to the marketplace at noon to hire some more. And then has to do the same again at 3 hours before quitting time. And then goes back again at 5, 1 hour before everyone goes home. Clearly, this guy is not a human resources wizard. Okay? But, as we heard, his questionable business practices are far from over. Because at the end of the day, he then tells his manager to do 2 things. 1, pay the workers hired at 5 first. And 2, pay them the exact same daily wage that everybody else got. Imagine that. Imagine that in this time with our recently avoided strike and our current United Auto Workers strike. How do you think that would go over? Just as it would today. Just as would be the case today. When those 6 a.m. workers, and I'm guessing probably the 9 and the noon too, when they find out about all of this, probably from the cheering and dancing they see from the 5 p.m. and probably the 3 p.m. workers on their way out of the vineyard, they are not thrilled. And when they protest the owner's compensation plan, in his defense, he says three things. One, didn't I pay you what we agreed to? Correct. Two, don't I have the right to do what I want, to distribute my wealth as I choose? But then third, he asks his own challenging question. Is it right for you to be jealous because I am kind to others? And the 6 a.m. workers, understandably, and probably we would feel the same, respond by saying, yeah. I'm sure this probably won't surprise you. But after reading a fair amount of them for the last 20 plus years, I can safely say to you that biblical commentators are not exactly known for their sense of humor. Which is why I literally laughed out loud when I came across this short, sweet comment from one biblical scholar about this passage. I quote, "Nobody likes this parable." Mwah, perfection. Nobody likes this parable. Sure. Because it runs counter. It runs counter to our desire for fairness. And it runs counter to our belief in the idea of merit. The idea that we get what we earn, what we deserve. That economically, professionally, educationally, when it comes to things like power and prestige and fame and wealth, what we get is directly proportional to how hard and how long and how well that we have worked in the vineyard. And I think that there is merit to the idea of merit. Some merit. But I think we need to hesitate to accept the idea of merit as gospel truth. It's not gospel truth for a number of reasons. It's not gospel truth because the reality is that not everyone starts from an equal or equitable beginning place. It's not gospel truth because we all don't have equitable or equal opportunities. It's not gospel truth because research has demonstrated over and over and over again that the greatest predictor of someone's eventual standing is the socioeconomic standing of their parents. It's not gospel truth because until recent court cases have started to seriously challenge it, we know that, for instance, legacy admissions have made it easier for some to get into top colleges. We know it's not gospel truth because we know about the continuing inequities and inequalities based on things like race and gender. The fact that, for instance, still, after all these years, women are not paid as much. They do not earn as much as men for similar or identical work. And I really shouldn't say earn, I should say receive. Thank you. We know those things. So we need to hesitate to consider merit as gospel truth in our economic system. But while many biblical scholars agree that the parable, as Jesus originally told it, certainly did have economic overtones, that it reflected the belief in ancient Jewish society that Jesus was a part of, that everyone's basic needs should be met, that in a good and moral and ethical society, that is the way things should be. As we also know, when it comes to Jesus' parables, they're never about just one thing. And this one is also like that. Because it is not just about economics. It's not just about material economics. It is also about spiritual economics. The spiritual economics of God. And particularly, the spiritual economics of God's grace. Grace. In the Christian spiritual tradition, grace is generally defined as the love and compassion and forgiveness and mercy that God grants us. That God grants freely. And God grants us that freely just because, just because. Just because we are. Just because we are God's people, created in the image and likeness of God. And so because of that, God grants us that love and kindness and forgiveness and mercy, all of that, not just freely, but unconditionally. We don't have to earn it. We don't have to deserve it. We don't have to merit it. In fact, theologians will say that grace is undeserved, unearned, unmerited, because it can't be. It can't be. It is simply from God. And because of that, God expects us to turn that grace around and do the same with others. Grace is a challenge. It's a challenge for us. Because again, like the parable in its discussion of economic matters, the idea of grace runs counter. It is contrary to so many of the ways that the world and humanity operates. Which makes it a challenge. It makes it a serious challenge for humanity. I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm wrong about this. But it seems to me that grace is becoming even more and more of a challenge for us. It seems to me that we are in a time when we struggle just as much with the spiritual economics of God's grace as we do with the material economics that the parable also points to. It seems to me that we have become, or at least more becoming, a graceless society. A society, a culture in which things like love and mercy and forgiveness and compassion are treated as transactions, as things that we expect others to earn from us, to deserve, and others expect the same from us, and therefore things that can so much more easily be either denied or taken away. But that is not the spiritual economics of God or God's grace as it is meant to be in the world. in our culture, in our lives. In a society, a culture run according to the spiritual economics of God's grace, we wouldn't automatically ascribe negative motives and characteristics to those that we disagree with or are different from. We wouldn't be so quick to condemn others over a single failing. We wouldn't insist on coercing agreement or acquiescence from those who are different from us because of what they look like or who they love or what they believe. That is not a society, a culture grounded in the spiritual economics of God's grace. For us to be that culture, that graceful culture, that graceful society, for us to be those graceful people, we need then to be willing to do two things. Two things that are presented to us in the parable that Jesus tells. A parable that is introduced with the phrase, the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven is like. Telling us that this represents not just the world in union with God and God's ways, but conquering nature, God's self. For us to be that graceful people, we need to do the two things the parable points to. One, we need to resist the urge, and the very strong urge, to convince ourselves that we are 6 a.m. workers. That we have worked harder and better and longer than others. That we are better people, that we are more faithful people, so then we are more deserving of God's grace. We need to resist convincing ourselves we are 6 a.m. workers. And I don't know about you, but considering the way that God actually calls us to live, there's a lot of times I'm not even sure I'm a 5 p.m. worker. And then the second thing that we must do is we must be willing to be the world's worst business owners. Willing to offer the full day age, the fullness of God's grace, to offer that love and compassion and forgiveness and mercy to others, regardless of whether we believe that they have earned it or deserved it or merit it. Really, without any consideration of that at all. Because that is how God is with us. So, Mr. Partridge, seriously, if we made God, what human would intentionally create a God like this? It's hard to imagine. But the good news is we don't have to. Amen.